It begins in the dark, 13 meters into a chamber inside Vanguard Cave, air that had not moved and light that had not touched anything for 40,000 years, until a research team finally broke through in early 2026. The chamber sits inside the Gorham's Cave complex, carved into the rock of Gibraltar, sealed since the Late Pleistocene by nothing more than compacted sand. A natural door nobody opened for 400 centuries. Leading the team is Professor Clive Finlayson of the Gibraltar National Museum. And what his researchers pulled from that darkness reads like a time capsule. Animal bones scattered across the chamber floor, worked stone tools left exactly where their makers set them down, and a single marine shell, carried in from the coast for reasons nobody can fully explain. These aren't just artifacts. They may be among the last physical traces left by some of the final Neanderthals to walk the earth. What does it mean that the closing chapter of an entire human species might be written into the stone of Spanish territory, and that we are only now turning the page? The sediment inside that chamber has never been disturbed, which means it could still be holding on to pollen grains, microscopic plant fragments, even fragments of ancient DNA that never had the chance to degrade. Taken together with everything else pulled from this coastline over the decades, the evidence points to something remarkable. Spain and Gibraltar, standing side by side, hold more Neanderthal material, physical and genetic, than almost any other place on the planet. If the idea of a cave sealed for 40,000 years finally being opened is the kind of thing that pulls you in, stay with this one. There is a subscribe button waiting somewhere below. But as significant as this chamber is, it is not the beginning of the story. Gibraltar is where the Neanderthal story in Spain closes. To understand how it got here, the story has to rewind, away from this sealed chamber and into the way an entire species has been misunderstood for generations. Start with a fact, stated plainly, no framing needed. Most people still carry around the same image, Neanderthals, as brutish, slow-witted, an evolutionary dead end that lost the race to smarter, more adaptable humans. The genetics tell a different story. Modern Europeans carry roughly 2 to 5% Neanderthal-derived DNA in their genomes, a figure confirmed through genetic cohort analysis that includes participants from Spain itself. That DNA is not spread evenly across the human genome. Some regions are dense with Neanderthal variants, holdovers that survive tens of thousands of years of human reproduction. Other regions have been almost entirely scrubbed clean, stretches scientists have come to call Neanderthal deserts, where those ancient variants simply did not survive. Some of what did survive sits in immune-related regions of the genome, including a specific variant on chromosome 3 that researchers have studied for its connection to severity outcomes in COVID-19. None of that fits the old narrative. A species does not quietly persist inside the immune systems of millions of living people, shaping how their bodies respond to a modern pandemic, if it was simply an inferior branch that lost and vanished. The brutish loser story does not hold up against genes that are still active, still running, still making a measurable difference in human biology today, including in the bodies of people living in Spain right now. The real story taking shape here is not one of extinction. It is one of persistence, genetic persistence carried forward in living populations, and physical persistence still buried in the ground, waiting. And nowhere has that persistence been documented more thoroughly, more precisely, than inside one cave tucked into the mountains of Asturias. It happened by accident. In 1994, a group of workers broke through into a hidden cave system beneath the mountains of Asturias in northern Spain, a subterranean karstic network known as El Sidrón. Nobody was looking for Neanderthals that day. What they found turned into one of the richest Neanderthal genetic sites anywhere on Earth, the remains of 12 individuals, all part of a single social group that lived and died together. The group broke down with striking clarity. 6 adults, 3 female and 3 male, 3 adolescents, 2 juveniles, and 1 infant. An entire cross-section of a Neanderthal family unit preserved in one place. Dating puts this group at somewhere between 43,000 and 49,000 years old. What makes El Sidrón exceptional isn't just the number of individuals. It's that every single one of them has preserved extractable DNA, a level of genetic completeness that is almost unheard of in paleogenetics, where DNA this old usually degrades past the point of recovery. That kind of preservation didn't happen by luck alone. The excavation team ran strict anti-contamination protocols from the start, built specifically so that whatever genetic data came out of the ground could actually be trusted by the wider scientific community. Leading much of that genetic work for the past 2 decades has been researcher Carles Lalueza Fox. of the Institute of Evolutionary Biology in Barcelona, piecing together, sample by sample, what this frozen family group can still tell us. What emerged from his lab didn't just put names and ages to 12 sets of remains. It started to reconstruct the shape of their daily lives, the structure of their relationships, and possibly, the final events that ended them. The fact stands on its own. In 2005, researchers announced the first Neanderthal mitochondrial DNA ever recovered from anywhere on the Iberian Peninsula, extracted from one individual at El Sidrón. That sequence carried a specific message. Iberian Neanderthals, isolated as they were on the peninsula, turned out to be genetically similar to Neanderthal populations recovered from sites thousands of kilometers away. That similarity ruled something out. It meant there was no extreme population bottleneck tied to the glacial maximum around 130,000 years ago shaping this particular group's genetic history, no isolated evolutionary detour caused by that climate event. Compared across every known site, Neanderthal genetic diversity as a whole is consistently lower than what's found in modern European populations, a pattern that holds true here as well. Inside the El Sidrón mitochondrial data, researchers also identified deeply rooted lineages at a specific sequence position, 16258, a marker that points to just how old this particular genetic branch really is. Despite living isolated in the mountains of northern Spain, cut off by geography from the rest of the continent, this population was not some genetically distinct Iberian subspecies, quietly evolving on its own. It was tightly linked, branch and root, to Neanderthal populations living across the rest of Europe. The family tree, once blurry, started coming into focus with each new sample pulled from the cave floor. But mapping the lineage only answered where these individuals came from. What had actually happened inside that family, in the years and moments before they died together, was the question the DNA still had to answer. Move straight into the fact. A 2011 study published in PNAS, led by Lalueza Fox and his colleagues, compared mitochondrial DNA lineages across the 6 adults at El Sidrón, 3 males and 3 females. The result was immediate and clear. The 3 adult males all shared closely matching mitochondrial lineages, nearly identical genetic threads running through each of them. The 3 adult females told a completely different story, each carrying a distinct, unrelated mitochondrial lineage, no overlap between any of them. Mitochondrial DNA passes down only through the mother, so that split in the data points directly to a specific social structure. The males stayed in the group they were born into for their entire lives. The females did not. They moved between groups to mate, arriving from elsewhere and bringing their own separate lineages with them. This pattern has a name: patrilocal mating behavior, the same structure documented in some modern human societies, and also observed among chimpanzees. What makes this finding significant goes beyond the mating pattern itself. This marked one of the first times genetic evidence, rather than tools or bones interpreted through archaeology alone, was used to reconstruct how a Neanderthal social group actually functioned. The women who arrived from outside, carrying unrelated lineages into an otherwise closed patrilineal group, likely provided the only source of genetic diversity this small and isolated population had access to. 12 individuals, 1 family structure, and a mating system that mirrors patterns still observed in living species today. That mixing of outside lineages kept the group's gene pool from collapsing entirely, but it was not enough to save them. The remains recovered from El Sidrón carry marks that tell a far darker part of this family's final story. A 2019 scientific report study on the El Sidrón skeletons, led by researchers including Rios, Kivel, and Rosas, cataloged 17 distinct congenital skeletal anomalies scattered across the group. Among them were narrowing of the nasal fossa, a retained deciduous canine that never gave way to an adult tooth, vertebral clefting along the spine, and a range of other developmental irregularities that don't typically appear together in a healthy, genetically diverse population. Finding that volume of anomalies concentrated in one small group is consistent with high levels of inbreeding, a population mating within a genetic pool too narrow to filter these traits out. This isn't an isolated case. Small, isolated Neanderthal groups, moving and mating within tight demographic limits, show up again and again across multiple sites in Iberia and the wider European record. That repetition has shifted how researchers think about the species' disappearance. Demographic isolation itself, not simply direct competition with modern humans arriving from elsewhere, is now treated as a real contributing factor in the eventual extinction of the Neanderthals. Among every fossil assemblage recovered to date, the El Sidrón group offers the clearest skeletal case study anywhere for making that argument. 17 anomalies laid out across a single family unit. A body of evidence rather than a single data point. Their skeletons carried the physical cost of that isolation. Joints and bones and teeth shaped by generations of a shrinking gene pool with nowhere new to draw from. But the same DNA that revealed the inbreeding also carried something else entirely. Something that had nothing to do with disease or deformity. Buried in those genetic sequences was the blueprint for how these individuals actually looked. Features locked into the code long before anyone thought to go looking for them. Buried in the DNA of El Sidrón specimen 12052 was a gene fragment nobody expected to find there. MC1R, the gene responsible for governing pigmentation in hair and skin. In 2007, a study published in Science, led by Holger Rumpler working alongside Carlos Lelueza Fox, sequenced MC1R from that 43,000-year-old individual and from a second specimen recovered at Monte Lacini in Italy. Both individuals carried a point mutation that has never once been observed in modern humans. A mutation that, when tested directly in human cells, impaired the normal function of the MC1R gene. That specific kind of impairment is the same mechanism that produces red hair and pale skin in living people today. Before drawing any conclusions, the research team worked to rule out contamination, checking the mutation against roughly 3,700 modern human samples, including the DNA of everyone who had physically touched the excavation site. Not one of them carried a match. Based on the frequency of the variant they found, the team estimated that at least 1% of the broader Neanderthal population carried this particular red hair, pale skin trait. Modern humans and Neanderthals did not inherit red hair from the same source. They arrived at it through two completely separate mutations, evolution independently solving the exact same problem twice, in two different species, without either one borrowing from the other. Hair color, though, was only ever the surface layer of what that genetic material could reveal. The deeper traits waiting inside those same 12 skeletons went further than appearance alone, reaching all the way down to what these individuals could taste, and what type of blood ran through their veins. A 2009 study in Biology Letters, drawing once again on DNA recovered from El Sidrón, sequenced the TAS2R38 gene, the receptor responsible for detecting bitter compounds in food. The functional variant the researchers recovered suggests these Neanderthals could taste bitterness in roughly the same way most modern humans can today, a trait directly tied to avoiding certain toxic plants in the wild. A separate study, published in 2008 in BMC Evolutionary Biology and also led by Lelueza Fox, turned to the ABO blood group system, examining two Spanish Neanderthal specimens for their blood type markers. Both individuals likely carried blood type O, the same blood type carried by roughly 45% of people living in Spain today. Layer this onto everything already pulled from the same 12 skeletons: the pigmentation data, the inbreeding signature, the reconstructed social structure, and the picture becomes unusually complete. No other Neanderthal site anywhere on Earth has produced this much reconstructed biology from a single population, this many overlapping systems of information, drawn from one family group. None of it would exist without the specific preservation conditions found inside El Sidrón's cave system, conditions rare enough that researchers still treat the site as one of a kind. Asturias, in the end, held the genetics, the blood types, the taste receptors, the inherited traits written directly into bone and tissue. 200 kilometers south, a different cave held something the genetics alone could never prove. Evidence that these were not simply bodies shaped by isolation and chance, but minds capable of something more. Move south now, to Cueva de los Aviones, a shallow cave sitting near the harbor at Cartagena in southeastern Spain. In 2010, researchers working the site recovered perforated marine shells stained with red and yellow ochre pigment, alongside shell containers still holding residue from mixtures of complex pigments, evidence of deliberate preparation rather than accident. A 2018 study in Science Advances, authored by Hoffman, Angelucci, Villaverde, Zapata, and Zilheo, applied uranium-thorium dating to the flowstone that had sealed the deposit shut for millennia. The result placed the material at somewhere between 115,000 and 120,000 years old. That age predates the earliest comparable symbolic objects associated with modern humans found anywhere in the world, by a margin of 20,000 to 40,000 years. Co-author João Zilhão of the University of Barcelona described these shells as the oldest known personal ornamentation objects on Earth, full stop. This wasn't a case of modern humans inventing personal jewelry first, with Neanderthals following along later, copying a behavior they picked up from someone else. The order runs the opposite direction. Neanderthals got there first, tens of thousands of years ahead of anyone else on the planet, shaping and staining shells for reasons that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with expression. What was found at Cueva de los Aviones stayed personal, small ochre-stained objects meant to be worn or carried by an individual. What came after moved into a different register entirely, no longer private and carried on the body, but painted directly onto the open rock of cave walls for anyone in the group to see. Across 3 separate caves in Spain, La Pasiega, Maltravieso, and Ardales, researchers identified wall paintings rendered in red pigment, marks left deliberately on stone rather than the product of any natural process. Uranium-thorium dating, published in Science in 2018 by the same Hoffman-led research team behind the Cartagena find, placed these paintings at more than 64,800 years old. Modern Homo sapiens did not reach Europe until roughly 20,000 years after that date, which leaves the math with only one possible candidate for who picked up the pigment and applied it to the wall: Neanderthals. The paintings themselves span several categories: geometric shapes, hand stencils pressed directly against the rock, and figures representing animals, the exact same symbolic categories that researchers had long assumed belonged exclusively to modern human behavior. Paul Pettit, a cave art specialist at Durham University and part of the research team, described the findings simply as Neanderthals creating meaningful symbols and placing them in meaningful locations. Excavations continue today at Ardales, carried forward by a joint German-Spanish research team still working through what the site has left to reveal. Spain's caves, across Cartagena, La Pasiega, Maltravieso, and Ardales, rewrote what researchers believed a Neanderthal mind was capable of producing, shifting the species from tool users into symbol makers. Gibraltar's caves, sealed for 40,000 years and only now cracked open, rewrote something different: how long that same capable mind actually managed to survive. Long before the word Neanderthal existed as a scientific term, Gibraltar had already found one and didn't know it. In 1848, a skull turned up at Forbes's quarry on the Rock of Gibraltar, 8 full years before the type specimen unearthed in Germany's Neander Valley, the discovery that would eventually give the entire species its name. Had the scientists holding that skull in 1848 recognized what they had in their hands, the species might carry a Spanish or Gibraltarian name today instead of a German one. A second major find followed decades later, in 1926, when the Devil's Tower child was uncovered at the same site complex, a young Neanderthal cranium that added another layer to Gibraltar's growing record. Together, these 2 finds anchor Gibraltar as one of the longest-running Neanderthal research locations anywhere in the world, a place that had already been documenting this species before the field of Neanderthal science officially existed. In 2016, that legacy was formally recognized when the full Gorham's cave complex, including Gorham's, Vanguard, Hyena, and Bennett's caves, was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Taken as a whole, the complex documents roughly 120,000 years of continuous occupation, spanning both Neanderthal and early modern human presence in the same stretch of coastline. That length of occupation was never just about the people themselves, the skulls and tools and shells left behind. It was about everything surrounding them too. Every animal they hunted, every resource they pulled from the coastline, every shift in the landscape that let them keep living there, long after other populations elsewhere in Europe had run out of options. A 2007 study in Quaternary International turned its focus to the animal remains found inside the Neanderthal occupation layers of Gorham's cave, cataloging exactly what these communities were living alongside and living off of. Researchers identified 2 amphibian species, 7 reptile species, and 11 species of large mammal within those layers. Alongside them were 44 distinct bird species and at least 10 species of intertidal mollusks pulled from the surrounding coastline. That mollusk data carries particular weight because it demonstrates these Neanderthals were actively exploiting coastal, marine resources, not simply relying on hunting large land mammals further inland. Gibraltar's geography made that possible. Sitting just 21 kilometers from the North African coast, the location gave this population access to an unusually stable, resource-rich microclimate, even as ice sheets tightened their grip across the rest of Europe during the same period. Paleobotanical analysis from the same region backs this up, describing pine, oak, juniper, and mixed woodland habitats that persisted nearby even through the harshest stretches of glacial climate. Southern Iberia's coastline has been described directly in the research literature as the most thermally stable refuge anywhere in Europe during the late Quaternary period, a description that sets this stretch of coast apart from nearly everywhere else on the continent. While populations elsewhere faced shrinking resources and collapsing habitats, this corner of southern Spain kept offering birds, mollusks, mammals, and woodland cover in relative abundance. That stability didn't save the population indefinitely, but it bought them something nobody else across Europe still had at that point: time. Level 4 at Gorham's Cave, a layer containing exclusively Neanderthal-associated Mousterian tools, has been dated using a sequence of 22 separate AMS radiocarbon dates, one of the most tightly dated Neanderthal layers anywhere in the record. That dating places late Neanderthal occupation at this site somewhere between roughly 33,000 and 24,000 years ago. Some analyses coming out of Finlayson's own team push the possible occupation window even later, as far as 28,000 years ago. Either figure places Gorham's Cave among the latest confirmed Neanderthal occupation sites found anywhere on the planet. Above that Mousterian layer sits a gap of more than 4,000 years before the overlying Upper Paleolithic layer begins, a layer associated with Solutrean culture and, by extension, modern humans, which first appears at the site around 18,500 years ago. That gap alone tells its own story, an empty stretch of time separating the last Neanderthal presence from the first confirmed modern human one. Researchers have tied the final disappearance of this population to a specific and especially harsh climate event, Heinrich Event 2, an unstable stretch of extreme cold and environmental disruption that struck the region between roughly 22,500 and 25,500 years ago. The evidence doesn't point to one dramatic clash between Neanderthals and incoming modern humans. It points to a slow climate squeeze, tightening steadily around the last refuge this population had left. That refuge, once its last occupants were gone, sat completely quiet for tens of thousands of years, undisturbed and sealed, until 2026 cracked it back open. The chamber opened this year sits inside Vanguard Cave, part of the very same Gorham's Cave complex that produced those final Mousterian dates from level 4. It had remained sealed by compacted sand since the late Pleistocene, no light reaching it, no air moving through it, no human disturbance of any kind for roughly 40,000 years. Finlayson's team located a narrow opening that led down into a space 13 meters deep, a chamber that had simply been waiting, untouched, since the last person who set foot in it walked away. Inside, they found animal bones, worked stone tools, and a single marine shell. Ordinary, everyday objects left behind by people who never could have imagined an audience would find them again 40,000 years later. The Gibraltar National Museum team has plans to keep excavating deeper into the sections that remain sealed, working carefully through material that has sat undisturbed for longer than most of human recorded history combined. Because the chamber was never disturbed by later occupation or modern contamination, researchers believe the floor sediment itself may still be holding onto microscopic plant remains, pollen grains, and potentially recoverable ancient DNA, preserved in conditions few other sites can offer. If that sediment DNA is successfully recovered, Gibraltar could end up producing genetic data from a Neanderthal context that has never once been touched by modern contamination, a level of purity that paleogenetics rarely gets to work with. Everything pulled from that chamber so far points backward, toward the final years of a population running out of refuge. The next major discovery in this story, though, pointed the entire narrative in a direction nobody working in the field had expected. For years, the assumed direction of ancient interbreeding between these two populations ran only one way: Neanderthal DNA flowing into modern humans as they spread outward from Africa and encountered Neanderthal groups already settled across Europe and Asia. A 2016 study in Nature, led by Kuhlwilm and colleagues, overturned part of that long-standing assumption. The research team sequenced new Neanderthal genomes pulled from 3 separate locations: Siberia's Altai Cave, a site in Croatia, and material from Spain. Comparing those genomes against each other revealed something nobody had confirmed before: gene flow moving in the opposite direction, early modern human DNA moving into the Neanderthal genome, dated as far back as 100,000 years ago. That timeline sits tens of thousands of years earlier than most previous estimates for when humans first left Africa in any significant numbers, pushing the timeline of contact between the two populations much further into the past than researchers had assumed. This was the first genetic evidence ever recovered showing humans contributing DNA into Neanderthals, rather than the far more familiar reverse. The Spanish genome data, sourced from sites including El Sidrón, served as one of the direct comparison points that made this reversal detectable in the first place. Without it, the pattern might never have surfaced clearly enough to publish. The exchange between these two populations did not end when Neanderthals themselves disappeared from the landscape. It simply went underground, folded permanently into the genetic code carried by every European population that has existed since. The MC1R variant tied to Neanderthal ancestry, the same lineage tested at El Sidrón, has never disappeared from modern populations. It still shows up today at a frequency of roughly 5% in Europeans, climbs to about 30% in continental East Asian populations, and reaches somewhere between 60 and 70% in Taiwanese Aboriginal populations. Separately, Neanderthal-derived DNA as a whole makes up an estimated 2 to 5% of the genome in people of European ancestry, a figure that has held steady across multiple studies. That inherited DNA isn't scattered randomly through the genome. Some regions carry a dense concentration of Neanderthal variants, while broad stretches known as Neanderthal deserts contain almost none at all, cleared out over tens of thousands of years of selection. A Spanish cohort study identified Neanderthal introgressed variants specifically on chromosome 3p21.32, variants associated with critical outcomes in COVID-19 patients, a direct link between ancient inheritance and a modern pandemic. Some of these inherited traits appear tied to cold resistance, to pathogen response, and to adaptations connected to reduced ultraviolet exposure, all traits that would have been genuinely useful for survival in Ice Age Eurasia, and all still present in bodies walking around today. Not every inherited variant carried a benefit. Most of what came through was likely mildly harmful, and natural selection spent tens of thousands of years gradually filtering that harmful material back out of the population. What's left is a filtered, functional remnant, carried forward invisibly, generation after generation, inside living cells. That invisible legacy is easy to overlook when it's confined to genetic sequences on a screen. One cave on Spain's northern coast showed that same handoff happening physically, in the ground itself, layer by layer. El Mirón Cave sits in Cantabria, on Spain's northern coast, a site researchers describe as a critical refuge during the last glacial maximum, spanning roughly 26,500 to 19,000 years ago. A recent study using sedimentary ancient DNA recovered genetic material directly from the cave's soil layers, pulling usable data without needing a single bone or tooth to work from. The lowest layer sampled at the site, a late Mousterian layer associated with Neanderthal occupation, sits directly beneath Gravettian, Solutrian, and initial Magdalenian layers, all linked to modern human presence, stacked one on top of the other in a single physical column. Working through that column, researchers identified 28 animal taxa in total, including what stands as the densest known Pleistocene sampling of wolf DNA found anywhere in Iberia. 15 of those 28 taxa had never even appeared in the physical bone record at this site before, meaning the sediment held evidence that centuries of conventional excavation had simply missed. Within the Solutrian layer specifically, researchers recovered 3 human mitochondrial DNA sequences, and those sequences showed lineage continuity running straight through the last glacial maximum, an unbroken thread surviving one of the harshest climate periods in the entire record. What makes El Mirón unusual is that all of this sits in one single cave, one continuous stratigraphic column, physically carrying the transition from Neanderthal occupation straight through to modern human occupation in the same ground, layer resting directly on layer. That transition, once isolated to a single cave in Cantabria, turned out not to be unique. Layer after layer, cave after cave, the same underlying pattern kept resurfacing across different corners of Spain. A study reassessing 13 sites across Cantabrian Spain generated 46 new radiocarbon dates using a method called ultrafiltration pretreatment, built specifically to strip out the kind of contamination that tends to skew older bone dates toward inaccurate results. The goal behind the project was straightforward: pin down exactly when Neanderthals gave way to anatomically modern humans across the region, site by site. What the results actually showed complicated the simple replacement story most people carry in their heads. The transition wasn't one clean, continent-wide event happening on a single timeline. It happened at different times in different places, shaped by local conditions specific to each individual valley and stretch of coastline. That regional variation lines up directly with what Gibraltar's much later dates had already suggested on their own, that some Iberian Neanderthal populations held on for thousands of years after populations elsewhere on the continent had already vanished entirely. Spain, in other words, was never a single, unified Neanderthal story with one beginning and one ending. It was dozens of overlapping, staggered endings, each one playing out inside its own micro-refuge, on its own timeline, shaped by its own local climate and resources. Every site pulled into this documentary so far, El Sidrón, Cueva de los Aviones, Gorham's Cave, El Mirón, represents one individual thread inside that staggered timeline, not a single unified narrative stretching neatly from start to finish. Each thread runs on its own clock, shaped by its own geography, ending at its own moment. And every one of those separate threads, no matter how differently each one plays out, eventually runs into the same deeper current running underneath everything that followed in modern Spain. Iberia's genetic history didn't stop being rewritten the moment Neanderthals disappeared from the landscape. A large-scale ancient DNA study led by Íñigo Olalde, working in coordination with David Reich's lab, sequenced 271 ancient Iberian genomes and combined that new data with 132 previously published samples, bringing the total to 403 individuals, spanning 8,000 years of history. The study identified a migration originating from the Pontic-Caspian steppe arriving in Iberia around 4,500 years ago, a migration that ended up replacing close to 40% of the region's existing ancestry. By roughly 2000 BCE, the shift had gone even further. Nearly 100% of the local male lineage had been replaced by the Y chromosome DNA of the incoming steppe population, an almost total turnover in a single line of inheritance. The same study also uncovered a single individual with North African ancestry, buried in central Iberia and dated to around 2500 BCE. Evidence of sporadic contact with North Africa that predates the region's widespread, well-documented contact by thousands of years. Every one of these later migrations layered new DNA directly on top of what already existed in the region, steppe ancestry stacking over earlier populations, contact events adding new threads into an already complicated genetic weave. Beneath every one of those layers, older than the steppe migration, older than the North African contact, older than any of it, sits the Neanderthal signal, buried under thousands of years of subsequent movement and mixing, but never fully erased from the record. Spain's DNA has been overwritten again and again, generation after generation, migration after migration. Only one layer in that entire record reaches back to before modern humans even arrived on the peninsula at all. That sealed chamber in Vanguard Cave sat completely undisturbed, while every layer of Iberian history above it changed hands again and again, steppe migrations sweeping through, North African contact leaving its mark, empires rising and falling, invasions reshaping borders, none of it ever reaching down far enough to disturb what was sealed below. 12 individuals resting in an Asturian cave, a handful of painted shells recovered near Cartagena, wall art discovered across 3 separate caves, and a Gibraltar refuge that held on longer than almost anywhere else on the entire continent. Together, these sites form the most complete Neanderthal genetic record found anywhere on Earth. The MC1R variant still carried by some red-headed Europeans walking around today traces directly back to specimen 1 2052 at El Sidrón, an unbroken genetic line running from a 43,000-year-old individual straight into the present. The 2 to 5% of Neanderthal DNA sitting inside the average European genome didn't arrive from nowhere, scattered in by chance. It arrived, in measurable part, from populations documented across Spain, populations whose bones and shells and painted walls now sit catalogued in research papers around the world. The Culhilm geneflow study proved that exchange ran in both directions, meaning some of what gets labeled Neanderthal in the historical record may have actually started out as ours, carried backward into their genome long before anyone assumed contact like that was even possible. Excavation at the newly opened Gibraltar chamber is still ongoing, with sediment analysis underway that could reveal even more than what's already been pulled from the floor. So when a group of researchers finally finishes excavating that chamber, sifting through sediment that hasn't moved in 40,000 years, the real question left standing is how much more of Spain's Neanderthal bloodline is still waiting down there, sealed, underground, for someone to finally come looking.